The worst mistakes in life are the ones that don't hurt until years later. On a bright Saturday afternoon in late spring, the stone church overlooking the lake shimmered beneath a clear blue sky. White roses lined the entrance. Soft piano music drifted through the open doors. Guests laughed, adjusted their suits and dresses, and gathered in small circles beneath strings of elegant lights. It was the kind of wedding people posted online with captions about perfect beginnings. And standing near the entrance with a confident smile was Jason Reed. He looked exactly like a man who believed he had one. His charcoal suit fit perfectly. His watch caught flashes of sunlight every time he moved his hand. Beside him stood Madison Brooks, his fiancée, her hand resting comfortably on his arm. They looked polished, successful, and happy. At least that was what everyone saw. Jason shook hands, accepted congratulations, and thanked guests for coming. Every smile he gave seemed effortless. Every laugh sounded natural. Yet every few minutes, his eyes drifted toward the parking lot beyond the church gates. It happened so often that even he barely noticed it. Madison did. "Are you expecting someone?" she asked with a playful smile. Jason looked away from the entrance. "No. Just checking if everyone made it." Madison nodded and continued talking to another guest. But Jason knew he had lied. There was one person he had expected not to see. One person he had convinced himself would never show up. Evelyn Carter. His ex-wife. 3 years had passed since the divorce. 3 years since she quietly packed her belongings and walked out of the house they once shared. 3 years since he watched her leave without shouting, without begging, and without trying to stop him from moving on. At first, her silence had felt like a victory. He remembered thinking she would eventually regret losing him. He remembered assuming she would spend years looking back at what they had built together. But life had become strangely quiet after she disappeared. No dramatic social media posts. No angry messages. No mutual friends carrying stories back and forth. It was as if Evelyn had stepped out of his world completely. And for reasons he never fully understood, that bothered him more than he cared to admit. Jason glanced toward the parking lot again. Empty. A small sense of relief settled into his chest. Maybe she had ignored the invitation. Maybe she had decided staying away was easier. Maybe she understood she no longer belonged in this chapter of his life. The thought should have satisfied him. Instead, it left behind a feeling he could not name. The wedding coordinator approached and handed him a clipboard. Guests were beginning to take their seats. The ceremony would start in less than 30 minutes. Everything was running perfectly. Exactly as planned. Jason scanned the guest list one final time before returning the clipboard. His eyes moved casually across familiar names. Business partners. Friends. Family members. Then they stopped. His fingers tightened around the edge of the paper. There it was. A name written neatly among the confirmed attendees. Evelyn Carter. For a moment, the sounds around him seemed distant. The laughter. The music. The conversations. All of it faded beneath the sudden rhythm of his heartbeat. She had accepted the invitation. She was coming. And for the first time that day, the confident smile on Jason Reed's face began to disappear. Jason stared at the name for several seconds before forcing himself to look away. Around him, the wedding continued exactly as it should. Guests laughed near the flower arrangements. Servers carried silver trays filled with sparkling drinks. Somewhere inside the church, someone tested the piano one final time. Yet the simple sight of 2 words on a guest list had changed everything. Evelyn Carter. She was coming. He handed the clipboard back to the coordinator and slipped his hands into his pockets. Madison noticed the shift immediately. She had always been observant. "Is everything okay?" she asked. Jason offered a quick smile. "Of course. But the answer felt rehearsed even to him. Madison studied his face for a moment before another guest pulled her into conversation. Jason remained where he was, staring toward the church entrance. The strange thing was that he had not thought much about Evelyn for years. At least that was what he told himself. Life moved quickly after the divorce. There had been promotions, vacations, business dinners, and eventually an engagement. Every milestone seemed to push the past a little farther away. Or so he believed. Yet standing there now, he found himself remembering details he had not thought about in years. The way Evelyn used to wake up before sunrise and sit on the back porch with a cup of coffee. The way she always remembered birthdays without needing reminders. The way she quietly fixed problems before anyone else even noticed they existed. Back then, he had mistaken consistency for something ordinary. He had mistaken loyalty for something guaranteed. The memories arrived one after another, unwanted and impossible to stop. He remembered their first apartment. It was barely 700 square feet. The air conditioning failed every summer. The kitchen was small enough that two people could barely stand inside it together. Yet Evelyn had somehow turned it into a home. She filled empty corners with warmth. She celebrated small victories as if they were major achievements. And when Jason spoke about his ambitions, she listened as if they mattered. For years, she stood beside him while he built the life he wanted. Then somewhere along the way, he stopped noticing. Success had a strange way of changing people. New opportunities brought new circles. New circles brought new expectations. The version of life that once felt exciting suddenly felt ordinary. Evelyn had not changed. Jason had. He glanced toward the parking lot again. Still nothing. A cool breeze drifted across the church grounds, carrying the scent of fresh roses. Guests continued arriving. Families posed for photographs. Everything looked perfect. Yet a quiet tension had begun growing beneath the surface of the afternoon. One of Jason's friends approached and clapped him on the shoulder. "Big day," he said with a grin. Jason nodded. "Yeah. It is." But his attention drifted again. He found himself wondering what Evelyn looked like now. Whether she had remarried. Whether she was happy. Whether she would even speak to him if they crossed paths inside the church. The question surprised him. 3 years ago, he would not have cared. At least that was what he claimed. Then his friend pointed toward the entrance. "Looks like more guests are arriving." Jason followed his gaze. A black luxury vehicle had just appeared beyond the gates. It rolled slowly up the long stone driveway toward the church. Nobody paid much attention at first. It was simply another guest arriving for the wedding. But for reasons he could not explain, Jason felt his heartbeat quicken. His eyes remained fixed on the vehicle as it moved closer. And somewhere deep inside, a feeling he had not experienced in years quietly returned. Anticipation. The vehicle moved slowly along the curved driveway, its polished surface reflecting the afternoon sun. Conversations near the entrance gradually faded as more guests noticed its arrival. There was nothing dramatic about it. No loud entrance. No attempt to attract attention. Yet something about it seemed to pull every eye in its direction. Jason remained completely still. He told himself he was overreacting. Hundreds of people owned luxury cars. This meant nothing. But his gaze never left the vehicle. The engine went silent. For a brief moment, nobody stepped out. The church bells echoed softly across the lake in the distance. Then the rear passenger door opened. A pair of elegant heels touched the pavement first. Jason felt his chest tighten before he even saw her face. The woman who stepped out looked familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Her blonde hair rested neatly on her shoulders. Her navy blue dress moved gently in the breeze. Nothing about her appearance felt excessive. Nothing seemed designed to impress. Yet she carried herself with a calm confidence that immediately drew attention. Several guests glanced toward her, then looked again. Jason stared without blinking. It was Evelyn. 3 years ago, she had walked away from his life carrying 2 suitcases and a quiet smile. The woman standing outside the church looked like someone entirely different. Not because she appeared wealthier. Not because she appeared glamorous. She simply looked at peace. That was what unsettled him most. There was no trace of bitterness on her face. No sadness. No visible sign of the woman he remembered leaving behind. It was as though the years had taken something from her and replaced it with something stronger. Nearby, a guest whispered her name. Another turned to look. Within seconds, small conversations began spreading through the crowd. Jason barely heard them. His focus remained fixed on Evelyn as she thanked the driver and adjusted the strap of her handbag. Madison followed his gaze and finally saw what everyone else had noticed. "Is that Evelyn?" she asked quietly. Jason swallowed. "Yes." Madison studied the woman near the vehicle. "She looks good." Jason did not answer. Because good was not the word that came to mind. The truth was harder to explain. Evelyn looked like someone who no longer needed anyone's approval. And that realization made him unexpectedly uncomfortable. Then something else happened. Someone opened the opposite rear door. A tall man stepped out. At first, nobody paid much attention. He wore a dark tailored suit and carried himself with effortless confidence. He looked to be in his early 40s. Clean-cut. Composed. The kind of man who immediately seemed comfortable in any room he entered. He closed the door and walked around the vehicle toward Evelyn. Jason frowned slightly. He had not expected her to arrive with anyone. The man smiled as he approached. Evelyn smiled back. It was not a dramatic moment. Not romantic. Not performative. Just 2 people sharing the kind of easy familiarity that comes from genuine comfort. Yet the sight stirred something unpleasant inside Jason. Questions appeared faster than answers. Who was he? A colleague? A friend? A boyfriend? The man offered his arm. Evelyn accepted naturally. Together they started walking toward the church entrance. The crowd seemed to part almost instinctively as they approached. Guests who had ignored the arrival seconds earlier now watched carefully. Jason felt his heartbeat growing louder. He had spent the last 3 years imagining what Evelyn's life might look like after the divorce. None of those versions looked like this. And as she moved closer to the church, carrying herself with quiet confidence beside a man Jason had never seen before, one uncomfortable realization settled into his mind. Whatever story he had been telling himself about Evelyn since the divorce was no longer true. As Evelyn walked through the church entrance beside the unknown man, Jason could not stop watching. He barely heard the conversations around him anymore. His attention remained fixed on the woman he thought he understood. Yet the person standing there now felt like a stranger. And without realizing it, his mind drifted backward. Back to the months after the divorce. Back to the version of Evelyn that had disappeared from his life. The first year had not been easy for her. Most people never saw that part. They only saw the result. They never saw the quiet apartment she rented on the edge of the city. They never saw the evenings when she sat alone at a small kitchen table surrounded by unpaid bills and unanswered questions. They never saw how often she started over. After the divorce, she could have spent her days talking about what she lost. Instead, she focused on what remained. One morning at a time. One decision at a time. One small step forward at a time. While others expected dramatic updates, Evelyn quietly rebuilt her life. She returned to work. She enrolled in professional certification courses during evenings and weekends. She spent countless hours studying while most people were asleep. There were mornings when she left home before sunrise with a travel mug of coffee and returned after dark exhausted but determined. Nobody applauded those moments. Nobody celebrated them online. Yet those were the moments that changed everything. Little by little, opportunities appeared. A new position. A larger project. A leadership role. Then another. She stopped measuring success by what she had lost and started measuring it by who she was becoming. The woman who once organized her life around someone else's dreams slowly began creating her own. There were setbacks. There were disappointments. There were days when progress felt invisible. But she kept moving. The remarkable thing was that she never spoke badly about Jason. Friends occasionally brought up his name. Family members sometimes expected anger. They never received it. Evelyn would simply smile politely and change the subject. It was not because she had forgotten. It was because she had stopped living inside the past. As the years passed, something inside her changed. Confidence replaced doubt. Peace replaced resentment. She learned how to enjoy quiet mornings again. She learned how to travel alone. She learned how to make decisions without seeking anyone else's approval. The strongest version of Evelyn did not emerge because life became easier. She emerged because she stopped waiting for life to be fair. Then, during a charity event 2 years after the divorce, she met someone unexpected. Not through a grand introduction. Not through a carefully arranged meeting. Just a simple conversation that lasted longer than either of them expected. A conversation that eventually became friendship. And a friendship that slowly became one of the most important relationships in her life. Back at the church, Jason watched Evelyn greet several guests with effortless warmth. People seemed genuinely happy to see her. She laughed softly at something an older woman said. The unknown man stood nearby, giving her space while remaining close enough to show quiet support. Jason frowned slightly. The image in front of him did not match the story he had carried for 3 years. He had always assumed Evelyn's best years happened when she was married to him. Looking at her now, he began to wonder if her best years had only started after she left. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in less than 15 minutes, but Jason found himself paying more attention to the man standing beside Evelyn than to the wedding itself. It was not jealousy. At least that was what he told himself. It was curiosity. Nothing more. Yet every time he looked in their direction, he found another reason to keep watching. The man never demanded attention. He was not the loudest person in the room. He did not move through the crowd introducing himself or trying to impress anyone. In fact, he seemed perfectly comfortable remaining in the background. And somehow, that made him even more noticeable. Evelyn spoke with several guests near the church entrance. The man stood nearby, occasionally smiling, occasionally exchanging a few polite words, but never interrupting. There was an ease between them that felt impossible to fake. Not the excitement of a new relationship. Something steadier. Something built over time. Jason watched as an elderly couple approached Evelyn. She greeted them warmly. The older woman reached out and embraced her. The man beside Evelyn stepped back respectfully, giving them privacy. When the conversation ended, he handed Evelyn a glass of water without being asked. Such a small gesture. Yet Jason noticed it immediately. Years ago, he might not have. Years ago, he would have been too focused on himself. Across the lawn, Madison was speaking with friends from work. Every so often she glanced toward Jason. He smiled whenever she looked his way, but the smile felt increasingly forced. Because every answer seemed to create new questions. Who exactly was this man? Why did he seem so familiar to some of the guests? Why were people approaching him with the same level of respect they showed local business leaders and executives? Jason spotted one of the venue owners greeting him personally. A few minutes later, another well-dressed guest crossed the lawn specifically to shake his hand. The encounters were brief but noticeable. The man remained polite and humble throughout each interaction. No grand introductions. No attempt to stand out. Yet people seemed genuinely pleased to see him. Jason folded his arms and watched from a distance. The longer he observed, the more unsettled he became. Not because the man appeared wealthy. Plenty of successful people attended weddings like this. It was something else. Confidence without arrogance. Influence without effort. Presence without performance. It was difficult to explain. Then another memory surfaced. 2 years after the divorce, Jason had heard a rumor through mutual acquaintances. Someone mentioned that Evelyn had become involved in several charitable organizations. Someone else said she had started appearing at professional events and fundraising galas. Jason never paid much attention at the time. He assumed it was ordinary networking. Looking at her now, he wondered how much had happened while he was busy assuming he already knew her story. A soft laugh pulled his attention back. Evelyn was smiling at something the man had just said. The expression looked genuine. Relaxed. Comfortable. Jason suddenly realized he could not remember the last time he had seen her smile like that during their marriage. The thought landed harder than he expected. Not because it made him angry. Because it made him wonder whether she had been happier after leaving him. Nearby, church doors opened wider as guests began moving inside. The ceremony would start soon. Conversations shifted. People gathered their belongings and found their seats. Evelyn and the man exchanged a quick glance before joining the flow of guests entering the church. Jason remained where he was for a moment longer. He watched them disappear through the doorway together. And for the first time all afternoon, a realization quietly settled into his mind. Whoever this man was, he was not a temporary chapter in Evelyn's life. He was part of the reason she looked so completely at peace. The church quickly filled with the warm sounds of conversation, soft music, and the quiet movement of guests finding their seats. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting gentle patterns of blue and gold across the polished wooden floor. From the outside, everything appeared perfect. But beneath the surface, curiosity had begun spreading through the room. It started with whispers. Small questions exchanged between guests. Nothing dramatic. Just observations. Who was the man with Evelyn? Why did so many people seem to recognize him? Why had several influential guests approached him before the ceremony even began? Jason noticed the conversations growing. Every time he looked across the room, someone else seemed to be glancing in the same direction. Yet the man remained completely unaffected by the attention. He sat beside Evelyn near the middle rows, speaking quietly with her while waiting for the ceremony to begin. He never looked around to see who was watching. He never appeared interested in being noticed. Somehow, that only made him more interesting. Jason took his place near the front with Madison. He should have been focused on the celebration. Instead, his attention kept drifting backward. A few rows behind him sat the woman he once knew better than anyone. Or at least the woman he thought he knew. The ceremony began. Guests stood as the wedding party entered. Music echoed through the church. Smiles appeared across the room. Yet even during the ceremony, Jason found himself distracted. Once or twice, he glanced over his shoulder. Evelyn remained calm and composed. The man beside her listened attentively throughout the service. At one point, she quietly smiled at something the officiant said. The expression seemed effortless. Genuine. Jason looked away immediately. For reasons he could not explain, seeing her happy felt more unsettling than seeing her successful. An hour later, guests moved from the church to the reception venue overlooking the lake. The ballroom was elegant without being excessive. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across the room. White roses decorated every table. Large windows revealed the water shimmering beneath the late afternoon sun. As servers moved between guests, conversations resumed. This time, however, the questions became harder to ignore. Jason overheard fragments while greeting attendees. "Do you know who he is?" one guest quietly asked another. "I feel like I have seen him somewhere before." "I know that face," someone else replied. "I just cannot place it." Across the ballroom, Evelyn and the man stood near one of the windows speaking with several guests. Every few minutes, someone else approached them. A local entrepreneur. A charity board member. An executive from a regional company. The pattern repeated itself often enough that Jason could no longer dismiss it as coincidence. Madison noticed it too. "People seem very interested in your ex-wife's friend," she said lightly while sipping a glass of sparkling water. Jason forced a small laugh. "Apparently." But neither of them sounded convinced. Then something unexpected happened. A well-known business owner from the city entered the reception. Jason recognized him immediately. The man rarely attended social events and was famous for guarding his time carefully. Yet the moment he arrived, he walked directly across the ballroom toward Evelyn's table. Not toward the bride and groom. Not toward the hosts. Toward Evelyn and the mysterious man. Jason watched the greeting from across the room. The business owner shook the man's hand with visible respect. They exchanged a few words. Then both men smiled. Nearby guests noticed it immediately. The whispers grew louder. Jason felt a strange knot tighten in his stomach. Because the questions that had filled the room all afternoon suddenly became his own. Who exactly was this man? And why did it seem like everyone knew something he did not? As the evening continued, the reception settled into a comfortable rhythm. Glasses clinked. Soft music drifted through the ballroom. Guests moved between conversations, laughter, and the dance floor. Yet for Jason, the room felt strangely smaller than before. No matter where he stood, his attention eventually returned to the same place. Evelyn. For nearly 3 years, he had imagined what this moment might look like if they ever crossed paths again. He assumed there would be awkwardness. Maybe resentment. Maybe regret. What he never imagined was distance. Not physical distance. Emotional distance. The kind that could not be measured in feet. Across the ballroom, Evelyn stood near one of the large windows overlooking the lake. The setting sun painted the water in shades of gold and amber behind her. She was speaking with several guests, completely at ease. Jason watched for a moment before finally making a decision. Without fully understanding why, he excused himself from a conversation and walked toward her. Each step felt heavier than it should have. As he approached, some of the guests gradually moved away, leaving Evelyn standing alone for the first time all evening. She turned and saw him coming. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. Then Evelyn smiled politely. The same way she might greet an old acquaintance. "Jason," she said. "Congratulations." Her voice was calm. Warm. Genuine. Nothing about it sounded forced. Jason nodded. "Thank you." Silence settled. Between them. Not uncomfortable. Just unfamiliar. Years ago, they could fill entire evenings with conversation. Now neither seemed certain where to begin. Jason glanced toward the lake. "It has been a long time." "It has," Evelyn replied. Another pause followed. Jason searched for something meaningful to say. Instead, he found himself asking a question he had not planned. "How have you been?" Evelyn smiled slightly. "Good." Just one word. Simple. Honest. And somehow impossible to challenge. Jason studied her face. He expected traces of the past. Some lingering sign that their shared history still carried weight. Instead, he saw peace. Not excitement. Not triumph. Peace. The realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "You look happy," he said quietly. Evelyn looked surprised by the comment. Then she nodded. I am. There was no hesitation in her answer. No need to prove it. No need to convince him. She simply was. Before Jason could respond, he noticed movement beside them. The unknown man had approached. He carried 2 glasses of sparkling water. Without interrupting, he handed one to Evelyn. She thanked him with a small smile. The exchange lasted only seconds. Yet it revealed more than words could have. Comfort. Trust. Familiarity. Jason suddenly felt like an outsider standing near a life he no longer belonged to. Evelyn turned toward the man. Jason, this is Nathan. Nathan extended his hand. Nice to meet you. Jason shook it. The grip was firm but relaxed. Nothing aggressive. Nothing performative. Just confidence. Nice to meet you too, Jason replied. Nathan smiled politely. Then his attention returned to Evelyn as naturally as breathing. The moment was subtle, but Jason noticed it immediately. Nathan was not trying to impress anyone. He was not competing. He did not seem threatened by the past. He simply stood beside Evelyn as though he knew exactly where he belonged. A few minutes later, another guest approached and pulled Nathan into a brief conversation. Evelyn remained near the window. Jason looked at her one final time. I am glad things worked out for you, he said. Evelyn's smile softened. Thank you. That was all. No accusations. No unfinished arguments. No discussion about what happened years ago. As Jason walked away, he realized something he had been refusing to admit all evening. He had expected this conversation to give him answers. Instead, it gave him something far more difficult. The undeniable realization that Evelyn had truly moved on. By the time dinner was served, the questions surrounding Nathan had become impossible to ignore. Conversations drifted from table to table. Guests spoke quietly, exchanging theories and half-remembered details. Someone claimed he had seen Nathan featured in a business magazine. Someone else insisted they had attended a charity event where he was a keynote speaker. Nobody seemed completely certain. Yet everyone appeared convinced that Nathan was someone important. Jason tried to focus on the evening. He smiled when expected. He thanked guests for attending. He stood beside Madison during photographs and conversations. But every few minutes, his attention returned to the same corner of the ballroom. Nathan and Evelyn sat together near the windows overlooking the lake. They looked perfectly comfortable. Not like people trying to impress a room. Like people who had nothing left to prove. The reception continued until the master of ceremonies stepped onto the small stage near the dance floor. The room gradually quieted. Glasses were lowered. Conversations paused. The evening had reached the point where special acknowledgments and speeches would begin. The host smiled warmly as he adjusted the microphone. Before we continue, he said, there are a few special guests we would like to thank for being here tonight. Applause followed. Several names were mentioned. Family members. Longtime friends. Community leaders. Then the host glanced toward one of the tables near the windows. His expression brightened. And I would also like to recognize someone whose generosity has helped support countless educational and community programs throughout the state. A few people immediately turned their heads. Others exchanged curious looks. Jason felt his attention sharpen. The host continued. Many of you already know him, but for those who do not, it is an honor to welcome Nathan Sinclair. For a brief second, the room became very still. Then applause erupted. Not polite applause. Genuine applause. The kind reserved for someone people truly respected. Nathan smiled modestly and nodded in acknowledgement. He looked almost uncomfortable with the attention. Jason felt the name settle into his mind. Nathan Sinclair. Suddenly, fragments of memory connected. Articles he had skimmed past online. Interviews mentioned during business meetings. Headlines attached to major investments and charitable foundations. Jason's stomach tightened. He knew exactly who Nathan Sinclair was. One of the most successful investors in the country. A billionaire whose companies employed thousands of people across multiple industries. A man whose influence extended far beyond the city where they now stood. Around the ballroom, whispers immediately spread. Guests who had been uncertain only minutes earlier now looked toward Nathan with open recognition. Some appeared surprised. Others looked impressed. A few simply shook their heads in disbelief. Yet Nathan remained exactly the same as he had all evening. Calm. Polite. Unaffected. He briefly thanked the host before returning his attention to Evelyn. Nothing about his behavior changed. And somehow, that made the revelation even more powerful. Jason glanced toward Evelyn. She did not appear surprised by the introduction. She did not seem impressed by the applause. She simply smiled at Nathan as though the entire room had confirmed something she already knew. In that moment, Jason finally understood why she had seemed so different from the second she arrived. It was not the car. It was not the dress. It was not even the man beside her. It was certainty. The certainty of someone who had built a life she genuinely loved. The applause gradually faded as the evening continued. Guests returned to their conversations. Music resumed. But Jason barely heard any of it. Because one thought kept repeating itself in his mind. 3 years ago, he believed Evelyn had walked away with less than he did. Standing in that ballroom now, watching her laugh quietly beside Nathan Sinclair, he realized how completely wrong he had been. The reception slowly moved toward its final hours. The music softened. Some guests drifted toward the outdoor terrace overlooking the lake while others gathered near the dance floor for one last conversation before the evening ended. The golden light of sunset had given way to the deep blue of early night. Reflections shimmered across the water beyond the ballroom windows. Jason stood alone near the edge of the room, watching the celebration continue around him. For the first time all day, he stopped looking at Nathan. He stopped thinking about the headlines, the businesses, the success, and the applause. Because he finally understood that none of those things explained what he had been feeling since Evelyn arrived. The truth was simpler than that. He missed the person he had failed to appreciate when she was standing right beside him. Across the room, Evelyn laughed softly during a conversation with friends. Nathan stood nearby, listening more than speaking. Every now and then their eyes met. No dramatic gestures. No need for attention. Just the quiet comfort of two people who genuinely enjoyed sharing the same space. Jason lowered his gaze. Years ago, he believed happiness looked like achievement. Promotions. Recognition. Bigger houses. More expensive vacations. More impressive titles. But looking at Evelyn now, he saw something entirely different. He saw peace. And peace was something money alone could never buy. Madison approached and gently touched his arm. "Ready to head out soon?" she asked. Jason looked at her and smiled. This time the smile felt honest. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." She followed his gaze across the ballroom. Evelyn and Nathan were preparing to leave as well. Guests stopped them occasionally to exchange goodbyes. The same warmth followed them everywhere they went. Not because of status. Not because of wealth. Because people genuinely enjoyed being around them. Jason watched as Nathan picked up Evelyn's coat and held it for her. Another simple gesture. Another moment that revealed more than words ever could. A few minutes later, Evelyn happened to glance in Jason's direction. Their eyes met one final time across the room. There was no sadness in her expression. No anger. No triumph. Only kindness. She offered a small smile. Jason returned it. In that brief exchange, neither person needed to explain anything. The past remained where it belonged. Then Evelyn turned toward the exit. Nathan walked beside her. Together they crossed the ballroom and disappeared through the doors leading toward the lakefront entrance. Jason continued watching until they were gone. Only then did he finally understand something that had taken him 3 years to learn. He had not lost Evelyn on the day the divorce papers were signed. He had lost her long before that. He lost her when he stopped valuing the quiet loyalty she gave so freely. He lost her when he assumed she would always be there. And most of all, he lost her when he failed to recognize her worth while he still had the chance. Outside, a luxury car pulled away into the night. Inside, the celebration continued. Yet Jason no longer felt the need to look toward the doors. Some chapters were meant to end. Some people were meant to grow beyond the places where they were once underestimated. Evelyn never returned to prove anyone wrong. She never returned for revenge. She never returned to reclaim what she had lost. She returned as a woman who had already found herself. And as the lights reflected across the dark water beyond the ballroom, one truth remained impossible to ignore. She did not win him back. She won herself.